Hi, everyone. I would like to talk to you and at the same time try and give you a bit of a break because you guys must be exhausted. If you've been doing half or a third of what we've been doing today and yesterday, I'm sure you need to relax. So I'm going to try and stand out in a different way by just giving you some soothing imagery to look at rather than 55 slides with a lot of writing. There will be a couple of slides with writing, but I think it's important to remember that we really need to think very carefully, no matter what business you're in, about how to stand out and put yourself in the consumer's shoes, because we're not the only ones that are exhausted. We may be exhausted for good reasons, given what we've lived through here in the past couple of days, but it's pretty exhausting being a consumer right now, and it's pretty difficult to navigate your way through the jungle of brands that are out there. And I don't care whether you're talking about the spirits industry or the on-premise industry. We live in a world as consumers that's overpopulated by brands clamoring for our attention. In the US alone, if you think about it, the market has a huge amount of brands just in the spirits industry. There are 14,000 brands of spirits on the market in the US, and that's just brands and not SKUs at any one time. Some come and some go. There are over 200,000 bars and restaurants carrying spirits in the US. So it's a really complicated world out there, which is why I think it's important sometimes to simplify. And one of the ways to simplify, and the first thing I'd like you guys to think about, is the power of visual imagery. The reason why that's important is because we live in a visual world, which sounds like a nonsense. But think about it, the power of sight for us as human beings is enormous. When you go to the beach and you want to find out what's going on in the water, you turn to your friends and say, I'm going to go and see how the water is. But you're not going to go and see how the water is, you're going to go and feel the water. But the power of the visual metaphor in our world is so strong that we talk and rely on sight a lot. And that in the last 20 years, with the rise of the digital age and social media, has just become ever more exacerbated. So what you are and how you express yourself has to go through imagery. And the important thing is that you need to differentiate. And there are lots of ways of standing out from the crowd, right? Here's my favorite from my youth, because yes, I was around for the first go-around of the punk rockers. If you want to stand out from a crowd, it's easy to stand out from a crowd. If differentiation is what you're all about, then there are some easy wins out there. The problem with differentiation, and the thing I want you to think about for your businesses, is differentiation needs to come with something else, and that's relevance. As my mother used to say, it's nice to be a punk rocker, but you might not want to turn up to the tea party. So you've somehow got to get to grips with both sides of the equation. On the one side, and you've seen some great examples already this afternoon, how do I stand out from the crowd? What is it that makes me different? And from the other side, how do I at the same time retain that relevancy? How do I end up in a place where I'm actually talking to people in a way that they're going to appreciate and decode and understand? It's a little bit like the balance that Marshall was talking about at the beginning. You have to have a successful brand, focus on both differentiation and relevancy. And there's a sweet spot between what you're saying and what people want to hear, and that's the sweet spot that you have to aim for. And how do you aim for it? Again, I'm trying to keep things simple. The way I like to think about successful brands in our industry is what I call the lollipop principle. What, I hear you asking, mentally at least, the hell is the lollipop principle, Robert? Well, if you want to succeed in this industry, or in most consumer-facing industries, you need a hard core of intrinsics that work and that are relevant. That's all of the stories behind the liquids, behind the products that you're making, and behind the stories that come with them. And you also need the wrapper, which is why I've got the lollipop here in two pieces. The wrapper is the emotional content. It's the stories you tell about the founder, about the people around the brand. It's everything that brings the brand to life. It's a very simple thought process, but I think if you apply it to your business, what I see out there are a lot of people carrying lollipops without the wrappers, and some people carrying wrappers without the lollipops. You need both to win in this industry. In our case, and I'll go through this very quickly just in passing, you can find inspiration for the hard part of the lollipop in almost anything. Our Widow Jane company, which has a modestly successful bourbon in the US called Widow Jane 10, uses water from our own mine in upstate New York. And that water has a very high mineral content that actually impacts the taste of the brand. And I haven't found anyone else that's doing this yet. Most people take water out of the tap, filter it, and use that to cut their whiskey. So it doesn't have to be complex, but there has to be something there in the lollipop that makes you stand out. And on the other side of this slide, we use cognac stills to make our single malt brand, Bren, which again is not necessarily particularly unusual, except that nobody else is doing it. And because we come from France and because we're made in the cognac region, we are true to the nature of spirits making in the region. And then on the wrapper, one of the examples I like to use, again from our portfolio, is Few. And one of the things that makes our Few brand successful is that emotional wrapper. And in our case, the wrapper is primarily driven by a lady on the left-hand side of the slide whose name is Frances E. Willard. Frances E. Willard was the lady who founded the Prohibition movement in the United States. If any of you have ever seen that famous black and white photograph with a bunch of very sour-looking Victorian ladies saying, "Liquor that has touched lips shall not touch ours," that's Frances E. Willard. She is a native of the same town where we make Few. She's also a cool person in her own right. She's the only woman with a statue in the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. So she's a hero to some extent, although in our industry, she's obviously, people have more mixed feelings about her. But the stories that we tell around Frances E. Willard, which are true, and because she's a native of the same city, which by the way was a dry city until Few came along, give us a wonderful wrapper around the reality of the product that we produce. And that's how you stand out. Shakespeare once said, and don't worry, this isn't turning into a university lecture, for those of you that are looking panicked. Shakespeare once said, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." To which we reply, yeah, but would it sell as well? If there's another thing that's fundamentally overlooked when you're starting or developing a brand in our industry, it's the name. Why is the name so important? Because we work in an industry, whether you're selling sangria or whether you're selling spirits, or whether you're in the bar industry and you want people to come to your bar, we work in an industry where consumers develop a very intimate and emotional relationship with your brand name, and they want to be able to use your brand name in public. Think about it. There are very few businesses in the world where people actually go into a public place and say your brand name out loud. It's not like I run down the corridors of Tesco's in the United Kingdom or Walmart in the US shouting out, "I'm going to buy a packet of Pampers because the baby needs some." You don't do that. But we work in an industry where people talk about our brands, where they walk into a bar and use that brand name out loud. And what's worse, they use that brand name out loud in front of a peer group that's going, "What the hell are you drinking? Why did you order that?" And what's even worse, they use it in front of professionals, like some of the professionals in this room, who are on the other side of the bar going, "So you want to order that? Okay." And they nod wisely. So the power of having the right name and the right stickiness of that name is important, because when you get to that bar and somebody says, "What are you going to have to drink?" you have about 3 seconds before you look like an idiot. You need to have brands that are memorable and that people can decode. And in our case, just to cite one example, we've seen that our brand Widow Jane is very successful because one of the reasons that it works is that it sticks as a brand name. And a final thought, just to give you something light and easy to go home with. So I haven't bombarded you with slides. I hope I've kept my promise of differentiation. But if there's one thing I want you guys to take away, it's that we're all in this industry, basically in a more or less long-term industry. Success very rarely happens overnight, which is why this industry is a little bit like dating. Bear with me. Go back to what I just said. Think about it. When you first meet someone in the human realm, generally the first thing you learn about is the name. Where does that name come from? Is that name memorable? Have I heard that name before? Am I going to remember that name? The second thing we all look at in both industries is the packaging. It's true. Then, if we like the name and we like the packaging, we tend to, at some point, sample the intrinsics in both the human realm and the beverage realm. If we like the intrinsics, we start to want to learn about the background story, and that's where the wrapper comes in. So far we've tried the intrinsics. Then we want to know what the backstory is. What's the emotional story behind this person? What's the emotional story behind this brand? What kind of company does it keep? What's the real story of its creation, its foundation, where it grew up? Very similar parallels. At some point, there occurs, and you've had some great examples today from Billy with Fortaleza, there occurs an emotional bonding for successful brands. People start to bond, they start to like each other, they start to want to spend time together. Before you know it, you may be going steady. You're probably still seeing some other people. You're certainly, in terms of brand repertoire, also drinking other things. The average consumer in the States drinks over 4 brands, and when you're younger and more experimental, it can be a lot more than that. So at some point in the process, you're going steady, and before you know it, in this long-term industry, you end up in a committed relationship. And that's what we're all aiming for. So as you go away and think about your brands and your businesses, think about modeling it on the development of a long-term relationship. We're very blessed not to be in a boring business, guys. This isn't car parts, this is beverage alcohol, and this is a very exciting industry with a very high level of consumer engagement, and that's why I encourage you to think about it in terms of dating. So my one wordy slide to summarize leaves you just 4 thoughts about how to stand out from the crowd. It's definitely too crowded out there, whichever market you look at. There is too much in the market, there is too many brands, there are too many outlets, there's too much being launched. The average consumer, just like all of you guys, if you've been around here the past couple of days, is kind of overwhelmed. In order to cut through, you need differentiation, but you also need to be relevant. And so you constantly need to be weighing those 2 things up. Don't be the punk rocker at the tea party. Make sure that you get both of those elements right. Think of your brand as having great intrinsics and great extrinsics. And if you can't remember what that's all about, just remember the lollipop in terms of the heart of the lollipop and the wrapper. And lastly, think of building a long-term relationship with your consumers, because we're in the slow-moving consumer goods business. So think about acquiring consumers as a form of dating. If you remember all of that, and God bless you if you do, you'll go far. Thank you very much.